Okay, good evening everybody. Welcome to Arts in the Pub. It's a big night tonight. We have 3 speakers, so we're going to jump straight into it. Our first speaker tonight is Laszlo Szabo. Please join me in welcoming Laszlo.
Right, before I launch into it, I'm going to explain my costume, which helps me get over my nerves. Through my business, I've just supported a filmmaking venture with an emerging filmmaker coming out of VCA, a final year graduate, Anna Batalimbisi, who has just made a film about blackbirding up North Queensland. I was encouraged by not only the pitch that she put to me, but by the fact that the project was very much a community-based thing. She even brought actors over from family and extended family from the Solomon Islands to be in the film to tell a very, very important story, one which I think has many angles to it, and hopefully we'll get more and more of those stories of the cane fields and of the assimilation of Pacific Island people into Australian culture. So that's what this is. It's a promo for her, and she's just sent me the merchandise today, fulfilling her crowdfunding obligations. And I have a few things to give away here. So there's some postcards if you want to send quirky little black and white pictures of people on the cane fields. 2 precious Solomon Island flag colours stubby holders, which are handmade by a community, and a couple of key rings, so you'll have to fight for them. I was going to run a lucky door prize, but I didn't have any tickets. Right, my name is Laszlo Szabo. I live in Armidale. I'm a community artist based here. I have been here since the beginning of 1993 and have worked almost exclusively in the field of community arts. I've just been told by the Australia Council what I am. I'm a multidisciplinary artist working in the field of community cultural development. Really, I'm just a gun for hire, and I have been for 20 odd years. I've pretty much worked exclusively in that field. I'm probably the longest lasting community artist in our region. I've worked from Lismore across to Moree, down to Coonabarabran and across to Port Macquarie, so I've worked in a fairly large footprint over the last 20 odd years. I have a theatre background, and I came to filmmaking quite late in the piece. I returned to film, if you like, with my community work. I'm going to tell you a story that takes you way back, and hopefully what this does is sort of this biography of mine kind of orients you towards what I think the word community means, and then I'll deal with filmmaking separately. I don't call myself a filmmaker. I use the medium in my work, so that kind of helps to orient you where I am. The film industry would have me called a videographer rather than a filmmaker, and I'm happy with that. I don't dispute that. I'm a working class kid, the child of refugee migrants who came to Australia in the late 50s, and I bring that up only because it's kind of pertinent to the situation that we find ourselves in here in this country and also in Europe. My folks fled Hungary pretty much, or very close to where that truck that had 70 people die in the back of it just recently. They crossed the border into Austria in late 1956, very close to that point. They didn't know each other. They met in a camp in Austria and then went on to Germany, which is where I was born. And then in the late 50s, 59, they were given passage through the Catholic Church, and I'll talk about the Catholic Church again later, to Australia. They had their choice, Canada or Australia. They had their choice of Melbourne or Sydney. They ended up in Sydney. We got stuck out at Skyville, way out near Windsor, which in those days was the boondocks in the middle of nowhere. And although the fence wasn't all that high, there was barbed wire atop it. And although people could, to some extent, come and go, we were still pretty much incarcerated. It was a camp. The idea was that after 12 months, we would be let out into the community. And most of those people there ended up either primarily on the Snowy scheme, either there or in Port Kembla. The idea was that if you were a married man, they wanted you at that stage to go to Port Kembla to work in the steelworks, And if you were single, you'd go up to the Snowy in the final stages of its construction. They kind of stopped married men going up there because they caused all sorts of trouble. They tried to abandon their wives, which is in fact what my father tried to do. And my mother, heavily pregnant with my sister, with me in tow, hunted him down, and we ended up living in Wollongong, in Fairy Meadow. So that was our start, yeah, out of 2 camps, and then assimilated into the boom, the construction of contemporary Australia. And if anyone wonders what contribution migrants make to this country, it's not just the Frank Lowies, the great success stories of the men in business. It's the people who built the dams, the railroads, the people who did the hack work, the work that we're accused of stealing from Australians, but also the work that Australians weren't really prepared to do at the time. Puts me in a kind of polemic situation, doesn't it? Most of my work is about cultural activism in some way or other. It's about empowering people to pick up the media, the arts and communications as a tool in terms of getting their stories out. Biography. Okay, so I grew up in Struggle Street, Mount Druitt. Anyone watched Struggle Street recently? I came from the inner urban ghettos of Sydney after we left Wollongong, after the work dried up. Marrickville, Newtown, all those places that got cleared of the poor, the working poor, to make way for development and for the gentrification of those suburbs. So as you walk along King Street, Newtown, walking into a trendy Thai restaurant, that's where we went op shopping to buy clothes when I was a kid. That's where we went to get our hair cut. That's where we met other migrants. Now, Hungarians don't kind of cluster in great communities. They kind of tend to be isolates mostly, although there are Hungarian communities in both Melbourne and Sydney. Pretty much they kind of kept to themselves. We did. I was isolated pretty much from the world of culture, of arts, even television. I didn't have television until I was nearly 17. I didn't go to the movies. I think I went to the movies 3 times as a kid. So the whole idea of filmmaking in the media was something I came to much, much later. Mount Druitt was worse than you saw on television in those days, in the early 70s. Although the drugs might not have been quite as hard, it was still a violent, nasty hellhole. And a poor, sensitive child like me who read books, who dreamt of faraway places, had a shit time there. I was bullied, harassed. I was subjected to domestic violence and alcoholism within my own family. We were kept in isolation from the outside world. We were surrounded by English, Irish, Scottish people. We lived in this very tight, small world. It wasn't until I went to university that I kind of came running and drank up everything that I could in terms of experience. Film, theatre, music, the whole thing. So I grew up in a cultural desert. The only thing I had was literature, and I was a bookish kid. I had my head in a book continuously. I could walk the house, I could walk the yard, either that or I was outside over the back, and over the back was the creek and the tip. So I spent a lot of my childhood on the tip, on my own. Found some great things. Numerous dead dogs, Nazi war helmets, all sorts of stuff there. My interest in the arts sort of came late. It was kind of, I was half-hearted about it, although I did get dragged into the school shows, the school concerts, to pad out the number of boys on stage. And it wasn't until after my parents split up that I could stop telling the lie that I was going to be an electrical engineer or a dentist, and then suddenly I turned towards the theatre. I went to University of New South Wales. I studied theatre and film there. Film, particularly so under the late Peter Gerdes, whose specialty was documentary. I went to the theatre 3 or 4 times a week. I went to every movie I could see, every art film that was recommended to me. I ended up working at the Opera House as a tour guide. I saw every show. I watched rehearsals. You couldn't drag me away from the place. I was there like 10, 12 hours a day, just soaking it all in. I went into the theatre when I left. I actually started as a street performer. I was one of the first wave of street performers in Sydney, setting myself alight outside the George Street cinemas and in King's Cross. And I recently just come across some of my peer group Thor Bloomfield, who started Legs on the Wall, and a few others. And we were the first ones out there in the late 70s, juggling, eating fire, buffoonery. And I worked my way through 2 years of university. I earned more in one night than I could in 5 nights working at Woolworths, which is why I kind of kept it up. The early 80s saw the film boom hit Australia, the 10BA, the infamous 10BA, when everybody rushed in this kind of gold rush mentality towards the film industry. I hung around it for a little while. I did come in from an oblique angle. I hung around with some of the people who were the last of the Sydney Film Co-op, some of those kind of radical political filmmakers of the 60s and the 70s. I hung out with Hugh Keys-Burns and the Macau Light Company, who were the kind of mainstays of Peter Brook's visit to Australia for the Mahabharata, and who were also largely cast in Mad Max, the first Mad Max film. I would have been in Mad Max, but I didn't want to dye my hair pink. I'd just got a new girlfriend and I just got a new job, and I said sorry. But the idea of riding a bike from Sydney to somewhere out in South Australia and not washing for 10 days, which was the direction that George gave us. I want you to hop on a bike. I don't want you to wash. I want you to just turn up as feral and as smelly as you can. I hung around the edges of the film industry. I didn't much like it. At that time, it was a kind of place for cowboys, and it was a kind of hard-drinking, drug-taking, messy kind of sphere. Lots of money was being made, lots of names were made in that period, and I found myself drawn to the theatre instead. I really wanted to, as it were, finish off my education. I ended up going to Melbourne. I was drawn to Melbourne to work with the APG and La Mama. That was a kind of like a pilgrimage. That was the Mecca for me. I got there, I walked into a room, there were 50 middle-aged people all squabbling, all old lefties, squabbling, not just because they were shutting down those theatres, but because they'd all slept with each other, they'd all fucked each other's lives up over the years, and there was lots of bitterness in that room. So I arrived in Melbourne going, hey, I'm ready to go, you know, the avant-garde, larrikin kind of theatre, shit. So I hadn't touched a film camera since my university days. It wasn't until I arrived here in Armidale, and that was after I'd retrained at TAFE. I consider myself to be one of TAFE's success stories. I retrained in my mid-40s in multimedia, and it was from there that I picked up the camera again. That coincides with the kind of the revolution in technology, of digital technology. In the interim, I ran a theatre company for nearly 10 years in Melbourne, which started in Sydney, and I ran this sort of fringe independent theatre company in Melbourne for nearly 10 years. The word independent was very uncommon then. It's used everywhere these days. Indie music, indie filmmaking, indie theatre. It was a pretty rare thing to do. And that was for 10 years, that was my apprenticeship as playwright, director, actor, producer, the whole gamut. I was just hungry to learn everything I could about that medium. I got to the end of it, I had a kind of enormous sense of dissatisfaction. I wasn't happy with what I was doing. I was caught up in the world of showbiz. I realised that I had only ever been inside black boxes, and if you know what the fringe theatre's about, you'll know that black boxes and church halls are the thing. And I was only mixing with actors, and I was only ever seeing the same kind of thing. And it took me a while to realise I'd had enough of it. I actually wanted to be out in the real world. Should I say that? Yeah. Amongst real people. And I began this kind of tentative venture out into community, doing shows for primary school kids, taking shows into prisons, trying to stretch my wings out of that whole kind of narrow, confined world of weren't you wonderful, darling, you know, how was I tonight, that kind of world. I'd had enough of that. It wasn't until I moved back to Sydney in 91 and then out to Bathurst that I really launched into this kind of community thing. I took on the Tues 1000, the big car race, and did the community entertainment for that, and nearly killed myself. We did 15 floats for the parade, a cabaret show, family entertainment in the park with something like 15 different events at the same time. gave birth to Circus Monoxide, for those of you that have ever come across them. It was hectic, but I kind of thought I've arrived, because I'm actually talking to farmers, I'm actually talking to people, the guy who runs the local milk bar. I've got people who can't act, but I can kind of shape them into something. Students from Mitchell Theatre and Media. I kind of felt this was the right place to be. I went to South Africa in '92 and did a kind of professional tour of community theatre and professional theatre. I looked at what was happening there. I'd already been kind of drawn to it in the mid-'80s when a lot of shows started to tour out of South Africa, the protest theatre that came out of South Africa. And I started to think, I like the way these people go about what they're doing. I like what they're saying. I like how they're saying it, that they're not shy of being popular. They're not shy of putting a song and a dance in a show, of telling stories directly to me. I was very much drawn to it. And so that professional kind of observation really cemented in my mind what I wanted to do. When we landed here in Armidale, straight out the door I worked on an autumn festival with the community, and then in a short space of time I was collaborating with the Aboriginal community and UNE Theatre Studies on the production of Munjong that went on in the town hall, and that really kind of kicked things off. I sort of floated a bit. By 2000 I kind of thought, people keep asking me for this kind of digital stuff, this media stuff, this video, it's kind of coming. So I went to TAFE, I took the year off, and one of my teachers here, and thanks to them, I actually found a way that I could survive in the regions. It's very difficult, almost impossible, and certainly impossible since we lost the New England Theatre Company, to actually imagine that you could work professionally in your own sphere. It was Chris Halligan, Councillor Chris Halligan, who was working in community, came up to me one day and said, we got this youth centre that's being run by Young Life out the back of council. You reckon you could come in and do some workshops with the kids? And I thought, oh yeah, I kind of got a vague idea from the work that I'd done at TAFE of what a digital camera might do. And then I started documenting community events. I was invited out to start documenting things like Harmony Day. I went on the road with the Archie Ruby tour. Some of you may remember that. We travelled the region, took a busload of kids, and we were the tag-alongs. We followed Archie and Ruby, Uncle Archie and Ruby around the region, and letting the kids film and document this tour. It's then that I crossed paths with the precursor to Beyond Empathy, when they were the sort of the northwestern chapter of Big Heart. And that led to one of the sort of the greatest collaborations for me, to work with a multimedia artist out in Moree, Maddie Priestley, who was using video and theatre in combination, not quite knowing how that would work. Immediately I could bring my theatre skills to bear on this, and we worked on these kind of multimedia shows. And that's become a kind of trademark for Beyond Empathy, as it has for Big Heart. There's these combinations of performance and video. So I was frantically learning this new form, this thing, picking up these domestic level cameras, these point and shoot things, partly because that gear made it accessible to all of us engaged on these projects, whereas a professional level camera is a kind of daunting thing. You've got too many buttons to push, lenses to change. So we went out on the road with these tiny little mini DV cameras that were shooting in kind of old standard definition formats, a crappy microphone stuck on it and one tripod. And we kind of, over the years, have layered up the kind of complexity. When you look at Lorina's film tonight, you'll see we're kind of way up the top there now. We're using professional gear, we're using larger crews. It's probably the closest to filmmaking of all of my projects. It's got more art in it, and that's partly because it's an elegy, it's a tribute to Lorina's grandmother. But it's also about learning skills. And one of the things that has driven my work all the way through is the need to share skills with people. It's one of the biggest things that we lack in the regions, one of the things that we so seldom have access to. I'll just point out that Metro Screen, who have backed Lorina and I for a number of years, we've been collaborators for 7 or 8 years. Metro Screen is closing. It's been a kind of vital part not only of the Sydney film scene of training and engendering young talent, promoting young talent. It's also been important to us in the regions through their various programs, is no more. So we were kind of lucky in that we managed to capitalise on what they had to offer over the years. When I talk about cultural activism, how am I going? Got 2 minutes. What's important is for me is that people participate in the projects. These are not films made by a filmmaker. They don't have that intervention of an artist or a director or a filmmaker in them. The projects often start with one person coming up to me and saying, how do I, could we, or could you show me how to? And that usually kicks them off. By the time we finish these projects, there may have been hundreds of people involved in some hands-on way in the processes. So my work is to devolve industry best practice from filmmaking, from media, from the arts, down to grassroots level, and to build skills within our community so that people can share their stories with the world. Mainstream media, for all the fact that what do they call it now? Information entertainment or something, infotainment. It's a $2.2 trillion industry globally. And to put that into some kind of perspective, that's more than the world's GDP in 1970. And that's just one aspect of the industry. Still, grassroots level stories don't get told. We do see them more and more now emerging on NITV. But the media's not really interested in a kid planting a tree unless there's perhaps a politician standing next to them as a news story. I walk this sort of fine line between those different forms, between documentary, between observational filmmaking. I'm very much influenced by people like David McDougall, the ethnographic filmmaker. Just to throw a few names at you, Louis Malle, whose films on India in the early 70s, where he went to India and just shot footage and then kind of worked out what film he was going to make after the fact. And the films, the later films of Werner Herzog. It's from them that I draw my stylistic and my method from those people. I'm interested in slow-moving stories about people, about community. When it comes to editing them, I've got to make sure that I've got everybody's face in the film. So that guides me. If I've got 300 people engaged on a project, little Johnny needs to be seen putting that tree in the ground or participating some way. So I'm not guided by the conventions of filmmaking, of those kinds of or documentary or current affairs or news. The processes of those elements of the industry are in fact inhibiting factors. They slow us down. They stop people from telling their own stories. So often we're out there just what they call these days running and gunning, which is out of the car, the camera on your shoulder, go. Something natural light. Occasionally you'll get a kind of setup, you'll get a microphone onto somebody, but you're going out with these projects and shooting 40, 50, 60 hours of footage. Sometimes the projects last a year, and from that kind of mass, you've actually got to kind of draw a story out, which is kind of like how we worked on my grandmother's country, which was to go out with, first of all, with Lorina and a crew, and I have to just kind of put a hand up to mentoring, because I also mentor people. So not only was I mentoring Lorina, I was mentoring an emerging producer, an emerging camera person, a sound person, 2 stills photographers. So not only are we busy herding family and community across the kind of region from Bourke to Tibooburra, but we're also engaged in a kind of learning and sharing of knowledge process. Anyway, and I'll do this asked about face. I should have acknowledged first of all the traditional owners, the elders, especially those here who've endorsed my work for the 20 odd years that I've been here. And I also just want to close by quite rightly acknowledging the sovereignty of the Aboriginal people. So thank you.
We've got time for maybe 2 or 3 questions, if that's okay with you. Are there any questions for Laszlo?
Yeah, what did you think of that doco on Struggle Street?
I was angry. I was angry as I was watching. I was furious. Yeah. But I also had to acknowledge that it was true. Yeah, I had to say I lived in those kinds of streets. I was angry because the first time a major series addresses that issue, it goes that way rather than looking at Mount Druitt and the western suburbs in a much broader context than that. Here, I found it to be smug, and I am class conscious. I found it to be a very white bread middle class view of where I came from, and it infuriated me. At the same time, I have to acknowledge that yes, there was a lot of truth in it. Yeah.
How much influence do you think your early childhood in teen years has upon your current work?
Oh, huge, huge. I've worked with the poor, the dispossessed, the disadvantaged, the marginalised almost for my entire working life. I mentioned the Catholic Church early on. My sense of community was generated. Mount Druitt was a funny place. They had this the Catholic Church had this bunch of German nuns and priests who had all worked out in the Kimberley for years from the 50s and the 60s, the Schoenstadters. And they got sent to Mount Druitt on a mission. Yeah? So they set up this this mission there. It was run by a priest by the name of Carl Bowes, who'd been a U-boat commander during the Second World War. So he was a pretty gruff kind of character, but very much a humanist, very much, you may know about liberation theology from Latin America, Pope Francis, the guy who sits on the throne these days, very akin to that. So they were very progressive people, but they had this not quite like the Scouts, but had this very highly organised and structured hierarchy of men's groups, women's groups, boys' groups. And from the age of 12, I was responsible for a group of boys, 10, the few years younger than me. And what that gave me was a strong sense of community. We would go on camp every summer. The older kids would go on safari camp. We'd trek around New South Wales. But this kind of sense of responsibility generated in us to each other, very kind of communalist. And I think my work is very profoundly underpinned by that sense of service to the community. When I made the break from show business, the first thing I became obsessed with was how can I serve? How can I actually walk out the door and say, are these skills useful to you? And how many of us can get involved in this process? But yeah, a profound influence. The kids I mentor, I don't want them living in the same kind of isolation, the arid, cultureless kind of environment and world that I grew up in. Yeah.
We might return to Rob, to Laszlo later, but we'll move on to our second speaker now, please. We'll move on to our second speaker now. Please join me in welcoming our second speaker, Rob Waters.
Like Laszlo did just then, let me first start by acknowledging country. I want to acknowledge country as a separate thing. Country is a living, breathing thing, and it has given us, as Aboriginal people, and I believe all of us, country gives us everything that we need to be. I also want to acknowledge elders, both past and present, because they've lit the way for us in the past. I'd also like to acknowledge our children for when we're gone as Aboriginal people. Our children are the ones that will hold the light when we're gone. My beautiful daughter is up the back, Erica May. That's her there. So I want to acknowledge all of our children, not just mine. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge that acknowledge story, because each and every one of us here bring a story to this place, just as I do, just as Laszlo and Lorina do, all of you do, and I just want to thank you all for coming along and letting me connect with you guys and be part of your story. So as Aboriginal people, we've transmitted our culture and our cultural knowledges over time through the sharing of story, through poetry, through dance, through song, art. You know, we've shared it around sharing food and around sitting around a fire, and we've done that forever. As a child, I grew up around my grandmother's dinner table. Now for me, when somebody talks of home, instant, I go back to my grandmother's dinner table. Not the lounge room, not the backyard, not the front yard. I go back to her dinner table, because that's where all the big stories happen, you know. When there were important stuff happening, the big yarns and stuff, that's where we were. We were sitting around her dinner table. Nan would be cooking dinner, Pop's at the head of the table. We always used to laugh and say that, yeah, Pop was the head of the family, Nan was the neck. Nan was the one that used to, if she turned left, he was turning left as well. He wore the pants, but she told him which ones he was going to wear. But that dinner table, that's where we learned, and that's where we were taught. Our little people, our kids sat in conversations with elders and with the adults and stuff, and talked about everything from history to science to law to politics to all that stuff. You know, we sat there with them and we engaged in conversations as kids. I remember one time, it was the first time I went to my friend's house. He was a white guy. I went to his house for dinner, and everyone sat at the table, quiet, elbows off the table, no one was speaking. I was thinking, what's wrong with you people? Like, at my grandmother's house, we're reaching across the dinner table, there's conversations going on all over the place, and people are sharing food, and it's happening, you know, and that's where conversation happened. So we talked about those things, law, politics, all that kind of stuff, but we also talked about the important stuff as well. We talked about family, we talked about laughter, we talked about love, we talked about the stuff that equipped us as young fellas to go out into the world and share our story with the world. We also learned that many of our stories and many of the best stories that we've got aren't the ones that are written down, you know. When we talk about story, we think about, the great books that we've read, books that have impacted on us and that kind of stuff. But for us, when we talk about story, like I said, bang, instant. I'm back to my grandmother's dinner table. I'm thinking about my nan and my pop. I'm thinking about my old Uncle John. I'm thinking about my Uncle Shorty. I'm thinking, all these people and the stories that they told us and how they impacted me and how I can take those lessons. That's where the important stuff happened. But yeah, we don't think about them as in books. They're not boxed in. They're not caged as such. Story's alive. The story in a book. I think story in a book might be like if we was to tell our story and write it down in a book, we disconnect it from home. We take it away from the place where it comes from. I think story comes from somewhere, and it comes from a place. The place that it was first shared before we wrote it down somewhere. It comes from somewhere. So when we write it down and we go, all right, that's the last copy of it. It's not an edited version. That's the last copy of it. We box it up and we disconnect it, and we stop it from being retold and reinterpreted by somebody. like I said, we come from there as well. I think we Aboriginal people, we believe we're connected to story as well, you know. We come from the same place that story does, the same way that we come from our parents, the same way that we come from our ancestors. We're born from story, we're born from the land. Can I pick this up? Like you're going to say no. But we're connected to it. You know, we're connected to story, and we're interconnected with it. It's part of who we are and what we do. And when we do acknowledgement of country or acknowledgement of or welcome to country and stuff, we talk about we're the custodians. I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of country because we don't own it. It's the same with story. We don't own story. We're custodians of story. You know, if we were the owners of story, when we go, story would go with us and it'd never be retold again. We're custodians of it. We have to look after story, same way that we look after land, and we pass it on. We don't. There's a quote from a Native American guy. I can't remember his name for the life of me. I should have wrote it down, but he said that we don't inherit this country from our grandparents. We borrow it from our grandchildren. And that's what it's about. And that's the same with story. So what am I doing here? I suppose I'm gonna share some of my poems and a little bit of the story behind them. So yeah, that's pretty much what I'm going to do tonight. And I hope you guys enjoy it. And again, thank you for coming along, and thank you for letting me be part of, I don't know, your story in the next chapter. And sorry for stepping on your bag. This first one that I'm going to share is a very important one to me. This one's, I suppose it's about grieving. And the whole process of grieving. Sorry. Yeah, this one's about grieving, and it's about that process that we go through, all of us go through. We lost my grandfather 3 years ago, and I think, well, I know that I'm still going through that process. It's going to take a while. Because he was a very important person to me, he was a very important person to my family and our community. And this one's his one, and I don't know, some of you guys might have heard it, and some may have not, but it's called I'm Not Ready for Springtime Yet. I seem to find comfort in the darkness of winter, in the coldness that cuts to my bones. I sit and I look at the brown lifeless fields as I sit with my darkness alone. You see, I'm happy in darkness with the sadness surrounding, yet it's easy for me to forget that life will continue with the change of the seasons, but I'm not ready for springtime yet. If your journey had finished when you left us that morning, you left us to sit and await, for you to return on the song of a mopoke or the cool breeze of winter so late. Yet the clock hands keep moving and another day passes, and no matter how much we all fret, the seasons keep changing and winter is fading, but I'm not ready for springtime yet. For just one day of winter is all that I'd ask for, to sit in the warm midday sun with you in the backyard, and I promise I'd listen to those stories of when you were young. But now the 4 seasons have come to full circle, and our cheeks, they're so rarely wet, because winter is fading as we smile and remember. But I'm not ready for springtime yet. Thank you. How am I going for time? Plenty of time? Yep. Oh, heaps of time. Heaps. I'm also going to read some other poems. Like I didn't just fall into poetry. I was I like Leslie, just grew up away from somewhere, and I needed something. I had an uncle, my Uncle John. He was a songwriter. We'd go around to his house on a Thursday or Friday night, and we'd go around there, and it was funny. He never write anything down. He had the photographic memory or something, because all of the songs that he'd ever written were stuck in his head. And we'd go around there, and we'd get there at like 7 at night, and we'd be there till midnight. He'd sing 20 or 30 different songs, and not one of them had he ever written down. He just remembered them, and he was one of my big influences. My old uncle, Uncle Donnie, was a poet, but I also had other influences as well. There was a Persian poet, he was called Rumi, and me being a bit of a, I don't know, I'm not a blokey kind of a bloke sometimes. I like love stories. I like the good things in life. I like chasing butterflies. The pretty things in life that make things happy, make things, even if for a little bit, just a little bit more pretty. And Rumi wrote a lot of stuff about love. So I want to share one of his ones. And I remember reading this, I don't know, about 10 years ago, and I think I fell in love with him. That's how good it is. It says, I want to see you, know your voice, recognise you when you first come round the corner, sense your scent when I've come into a room you've just left, know the lift of your heel, the glide of your foot, become familiar with the way that you purse your lips, then let them part just the slightest bit when I lean into your space and kiss you. I want to know the joy of how you whisper more. Who writes that? Who writes that? Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. But yeah, I don't know. I fell into poetry. I think I was about 15 when I started writing. Anyway, got a few published down there in Sydney, and I've been writing them. I think I've lost more poems than I've still got. I think I've written them down and lost more than I'd even remember. My mum, up the back there, hiding her face against the wall, next to my daughter. Her and my old grandmother, they keep threatening to put them in a book. So I'll be doing that very shortly. But yeah, I've been writing them for a while, and I love them. I love poetry. I love storytelling. I think it's part of who we are, as people, not just as Aboriginal people, but it's we want to tell our story, and for me, poetry is the way that I can tell the story. Some people can paint, some people can write, some people can dance or whatever, make films. Mine's through this. Like I said earlier, when we were around the tables and stuff, we'd listen to things about about history, science, all that kind of stuff, and history was a big one for me. Hearing about a lot of the stories that happened, of things that happened to Aboriginal people, and I wanted to be able to tell those stories as well. So this next one here that I'll share with you guys is called Before the Ghost Came, and yeah, I'll just read it out. The children ran through the long grass. They hung from trees as laughter lined the riverbanks. The old people were there to teach them, to show them the old ways. But that was before the ghost came. The young men and old men hunted well, and our mothers cared for us with good food. We ate like kings and queens in those days that have not been talked about for far too long. Those days before the ghost came. See, we were happy. We were connected. We were connected to family, connected to home. We were connected to this place here beneath our feet, but that was before the ghost came. And then one day a new thunder rang, and lightning from long sticks struck the young men and old men down alike, and the children, well, they ran back to the long grass. And again they hung from trees. But there was no laughter left. There were no old people. There was no connection. There was nothing like it used to be before the ghost came. There were only ghosts. Skip that one. So this last one that I want to share with you, I wrote this for a friend of mine. I went up to Byron Bay on a trip and spent a few days with her, and she told me all about her story. She's a Palestinian woman. Her father and her grandfather's village was out near the Galilee Sea, and she told me the story of 1948 with Al-Nakba, the catastrophe, about when she was when her grandfather it was just on the feast day and the big harvest day for the wheat, and forces invaded into the village, and they were taking control of the village, or they were killing people basically. The forces were coming in through the front door, and her grandfather was pushing his family out the back, pushing them out the back door and running away. And they were running for anywhere that they could find, anywhere safe. They were crossing a bridge into Lebanon, sorry, and half the family was up here, and her father was right at the back, and a shell hit the bridge, blew the bridge up. Her father was left stranded. Now, he was a 4-year-old kid, just left stranded in the middle of nowhere, from his family. And yeah, he wasn't in a good space. And then a woman who'd lived just down the street from him came along and picked him up, and saw him and picked him up, and went down the river and crossed at a different crossing, and they got across the river. And they were coming into Lebanon, and just before they got to Lebanon, she was killed. So again, he was a 4-year-old kid left in the middle of nowhere. He got over the border into one of the refugee camps that was set up, and he was walking along, and next thing you know, this dog comes out of nowhere, out of the back, and ran up to him. And he looked down, and the dog's sniffing, and it was his dog, his family dog, in Lebanon. The dog took him to his family in a whole different country, and met up back with the family. Now, the grandfather, as I said, he was I didn't say, but he was an important man in the village, a very important man, and he was very well respected. And this was about the wheat harvest days kind of thing. And by this time was a few days had passed, and and Rahab, her name is Rahab Sharita. Her father said to her grandfather, "I'm hungry. I need food. I haven't eaten." You know, this was a couple of days later. And people in the village said that was the first time that they'd seen her grandfather cry, because for so long he was an important man. He'd harvested all this wheat, he'd provided for his family and all this kind of stuff, and this was the first time in forever that he'd not been able to provide for his family. So what he did, he said to his wife, "You look after the kids, I'm going back." And he walked back into Palestine against this whole army to go and find food. 3 days later, he returned on horseback, sacks of wheat with all of this food and stuff like that. And got back and ended up being able to feed his family again. And when she told me this story, it was an amazing time. For me, I couldn't imagine what it was like for him. So this one here is her poem. There was something else I wanted to say, that she went back over there to Palestine, to her grandfather's village. I think she was about 18, and she got back there. It was the first time that she'd ever been there, you know, since the family were taken away and since they were pushed out of Palestine. And you know, we, as Aboriginal people, we talk about, you know, connection to country and about home and the importance of home and all this kind of stuff, and she kind of got that. She knew what that meant, you know, about dispossession or about, you know, about needing that connection to home. But she said it wasn't until she got back to Palestine that she understood what it meant. Because she went to her grandfather's village, she took her shoes off and she walked on the dirt. And she said that place remembered my footsteps, even though I'd never been there before. I said, yeah, that's it. That's home. Home remembers us. Home, you know, we're connected to country. If Aboriginal people, we believe that we're born from country, country knows we're here, wherever we are. This is called I Speak Her Name. I speak her name in my head over and over. I smile and I speak it softly. I speak it softly, for within her name lies a poem, and any poem worth telling doesn't need to be shouted. It's a poem that tells stories of survival. It tells stories of defiance and stories of truth. It tells stories of why mere men have written poetry for beautiful women for as long as there have been beautiful women and mere men, and the words to describe what it's like to have looked upon such beauty. Within her stride, she carries the stories of her old people, of days lived and lost, and of moments whose stories just need to be told. And with shoulders square to the world, she treads so lightly upon the earth, and though hurried, she walks aware that she is not the first, nor will she be the last to have walked upon that ground. And as her words rush forth from those lips, you can hear her grandfather's story upon them. Strong, staunch and gentle. You hear stories of walking with empty hands and a heavy heart back into Palestine, and of his return on horseback with the food that he was always known to provide. Now I can try to do her justice, even though it's with words that don't even know what it's like to have seen the land that she talks of. And I can try to show the world of why I speak her name in my head over and over, of why I smile, and of why I speak her name so softly. Thank you. So again, Thank you. No, I need wine. Yes.
We'd like to know where his grandfather got the food for the family.
He went back to the village.
To his
To his village. Yeah. He went back to his village and stole it. Stole it from people that had taken it from him. No other questions? Awesome. Ooh.
So you were talking about putting your poetry into a book. I actually think that's a fantastic idea. Do you have any kind of plan for how you're going to do that from this point, or is it just an idea?
It's a bit of a plan. I'm going to be doing it as part of my study next year. I've got a scholarship to start. I think one of my supervisors is sitting right there. So yeah, and part of that it's in a creative practice part of the study. So I'll be doing a book of poetry, short story, connecting it to a SoundCloud and a YouTube channel. Doing a little bit of, I've got a friend in Tamworth that's got some property outside of Tamworth. We'll do some hikes as well. So hike up to a mountain and stay on the mountain for a couple of days, and do some cultural camps and storytelling and poetry camps up on the mountain. Hike down to the next one and just like video that. And yeah, kind of document, put it into a book, put it onto YouTube, and that'll be my next 3 years, hopefully. No other questions? Awesome.
Well, please join me in thanking Rob once again. Our final speaker for evening is Lorina Barker. Would you please join me once again in welcoming Lorina?
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Nathan. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose country we've gathered this evening, and elders both past and present. So I guess to just reiterate what Laszlo's sentiments in regards to Metro Screen, for people who live in the bush like us, having the opportunities that Metro Screen offered us and the skill sets that they provided to us is I guess, nothing but phenomenal, and the people they matched us up with. And I think the question I asked Laz is, when I heard and we got the email circulated that Metro Screen didn't get its funding to see it through for the next couple of years, and it would close at the end of this year. One of my questions is what do we do now? What do people in the bush do to get that skills and experiences to be matched with people, with editors, producers, directors, film crews? We would most likely have to go and search for that ourselves and find the buckets of funding that we need in order to make the films that we want to share or we want to record. So it is a great loss, and I know that, like myself and other young people who came out of Armidale from the film school here at TAFE, who started here and then went down to Sydney and explored. That was their base. Metro Screen was their base, so it offered a lot of courses that students from TAFE could do, and so yeah, it's a great tragedy, but I'm sure new doors will open and something else will come up hopefully in the future. So I'm forever grateful for the love and support of my family who are not here tonight, but my family, my friends and colleagues are. So it's with their permission that I present and screen my film. That I think my thunder was taken away this afternoon, because NITV showed it again at 6:45, and some of you have already watched it, so apologies if because some friends have not yet seen it, and my little friend Peyton over there has come all the way just to watch it tonight, so it's why I'm going to play it again, just for him. So as Indigenous people, we're from traditionally oral societies. I guess when people often ask us the question about what is oral history, what is traditional oral history, you know, oral history, I guess for Aboriginal people, we often take it for granted because we live it every day. It's a part of who we are, where we come from, and who we're related to. So like what Rob was saying, it's a living, breathing practice, and we share these living stories on a day-to-day basis. And that's something I learnt also, and to use the living stories that we generate was from a colleague from the Wadjung people from Perth in Western Australia. So to give you, I usually, because I'm a typical academic, I usually show a slide and have to persevere with telling you what it was like to make a film about my family and community, making a film for my family and community. So I don't know anything else, I apologise. So of course, just to give you some background information, if you don't know where Tibooburra is, it's in the corner country of New South Wales. The Wonkamara country goes over both New South Wales and Queensland. And unfortunately, because of native title, we had to negotiate with neighbouring tribes for a parcel of land on the South Australian side. But again, that's a little bit contentious. So this is my beautiful grandmother, Amy. She's a Adnyamatna Wonkamara woman so I'm a descendant of the Wonkamara and Adnyamatna people from Flinders Ranges, and the Wonkamara people from southwest Queensland and northwest New South Wales, and also the Murawari people of northwest New South Wales, the Kunya people of southwest Queensland. So this is just to give you a little preview about where Wonkamara country is. Again, that's a native title map and some of our neighbouring tribes on either side. So this is just give you some point of reference of where it's not going to go. A point of reference from where my family was moved from. So Tibooburra is here, and they were moved to Brewarna Mission over here. Again, he's talking about mission, so there's just the mission huts and also the blanket day from the 1930s. So he's just talking about life on the mission. Again, photos from the archives and about Brewarna Mission, the church area, and where the kids were taught school. And then this was a part of a ceremonial day at the mission, at the whole mission. So some of the gems in the archives, the images, stories and digitised voices that I've been able to collect as part of this. And next week I will be venturing over to South Australia where the Tyndale collection is housed, and hopefully find the records. So these are my great-grandmothers, my great-grandmother Charlotte. So this is my nan's mum, that's Ruby's mum, and this is Rosie's mum. So the generations of it, and we're the women that travelled from Tibooburra to Brewarna Mission. So again, it's a little lullaby that comes from the sung by Annie June Barker that she learnt on the mission when she was there, and so she gives the English and the Wonkamara versions. Again, these are my grandmother's brothers and sisters. My nan was very small when these photos were taken in 1938, so I suspect that either she was photographed with my great-grandmother Ruby, and if you look at these larger version of these photographs, there's an old shadow a man in the background, so I think that was my great-grandfather waiting for his kids to be stood up in front of this black box camera and made to do these tests. So back then they also had the lap band tests. So behind these photographs, there's a lot of details about where the people come from, the height, their age, as well as the drawings that they did, the maths tests that they did, and the writing, the literacy and numeracy tests. So I haven't seen those yet, so I can't wait to have a look at them. So this is just my cast, my family, who were the cast members of my film. My film crew, of course, my mentor and editor and colleague and friend, Laszlo, and some of the other crew. Brendan, Josh, Fran, Leanne, and the two Leanne's two daughters. So representing images and voices and stories in film. So these are some of the things that I struggled with trying to making the film, and I often talked with Laszlo through and how to represent my grandmother. So my grandmother joined our ancestors 2 weeks after I was awarded a position on the 2014 Breaks program at Metro Screen. It's a creative it was a creative storytelling program that offers 8 filmmakers, writers, directors and producers the opportunity to develop their scripts on screen and provide funding, production equipment and intensive development workshops. And they've run in their last Breaks program this year, and I think most of them are in the final cut stages now. So while my grandmother gave permission for me to enter the program and to visually tell her story throughout the production, I constantly struggled with how and in what ways to culturally and sensitively represent my grandmother's image, voice and story, and those of other people, especially those family and community members who have joined our ancestors. This is an excerpt of my grandmother's poem. So this was, I had a conversation with my grandmother about telling me the story about the removal over the phone, and then I produced this poem, and so this poem became the script and as part of my application for the Metro Screen. And I'll try to play you. It probably won't work.
What couldn't get a ride in the buggy and the donkey wagon from South Australia? We all walked all those kids. We'd jump on where we could get a bit of a room and then walk on again into the rabbits and waddies and that. We didn't mind walking on to get away from Green.
So what she's saying is just talking about the time they walked off in 1941-42 from Brewarna Mission, and so they was riding on the back of her grandfather's donkey team. So again, things that I struggled with throughout is whether to subtitle or not subtitle Aboriginal English, and again. I use the poetry, so the poetry gives it's a kind of a mind map through the film, and it's used in the subtitle. So I use this throughout the film, and this is just a version of the poem. And this is my Granny Ruby, and this one might play. So again, she's talking about when they were brought from Tibooburra to Brewarna, and so she's talking about the journey. And again, these recordings I'm not sure, this set of recordings were collected by the National Parks and Wildlife Services in Tibooburra. They discovered the audio recording, they put it together. When I got a copy of it, when I requested a copy, they knew it was Wankamara stories because they were talking about the Wankamara people, the Tibooburra people, but they had no names, so it was from memory and from known family members' voices and listening to the recordings that I recognised, so I was able to name family members. But again, so my grandmother Ruby's voice is on the TV version, it's included, and one of the things that my family have said that if you hear both recordings of my grandmother and great-grandmother, they sound very much similar, and sometimes indistinguishable about who it actually is. But And that's how I recognised that was my Granny Ruby, because she sounded so much like my nan. So I didn't know my Granny Ruby. She passed along, joined our ancestors a long time before I was even born. So that's just her, probably early 1920s, photo taken with her family members at Inaminka on the South Australian side. So you can, of course, if you look at the archival photographs, the difference of how Granny Ruby looked then to how she looked very aged and haggard in the Tyndale photographs. Again, I sort of look at and reflect on where am I in the film as all my dual roles that I've had as, you know, like Laszlo, I don't like to call myself a filmmaker, but as a family member, community person and an insider to my community, and as an academic, how do I put myself in the frame, especially when who has to tell the story, because my grandmother's no longer here, and whose voices need to be heard to be able to tell the true and accurate depiction of the story. So oral history on film, what does it look like? There was different times we were around the campfire, me and my mum being recorded. Some of these recordings didn't happen because it was too fuzzy, I couldn't use it. Sometimes the recordings, somebody else had said the same thing that was much more clearer, so we didn't want to double up on recordings. And so what we had to do is fall back on me being the narrator, which I didn't really want to be. And I didn't want to appear like godlike and telling the story of my family. But in the end, I kind of had to piece it together to tell the story, and also had to get used to my own voice, recording in a studio, recording these narratives that I had written down with Laszlo, and he recorded me with the camera over and over and over again until it sounded like the one I wanted. The campfire nights, so there's stories behind these, but I won't go into them because I have time. So, you know, that fire night was, we got, our car broke down in the between Wanaring and Burke. The cruisers had left us. One was in Tibooburra, the other one was in Wanaring, and Laszlo had to come back and rescue these damsels in distress and bring us some food and water. And so in the meantime, we sat around, made a fire, telling ghost stories as you do, and talking about teaching the young girls about how to make fires, my nieces. And of course, this was a part of the film that you'll see. So my grandmother left her country on the back of one of these trucks. This is one of the archival photographs from that period. These are the Wankamara, a truck carrying the Wankamara men, old men and young boys, and as you can see, and why, as Rob was pointing out, how important dogs are, especially to Aboriginal people. The old people wouldn't get on these trucks without their dogs, so some dogs made the journey. Others were left behind, and some probably perished between Wanaring and Tibooburra. So my grandmother left her country on the back of a red truck, what the residents at the mission called shaft cutters, and as part of the film and the making of the film, we took my grandmother's spirit home in my mum's red one-tonner truck that we nicknamed the Red Bullet. So that's enough for me, and I'll let you watch the film. Thank you.
Grandmother has a 4-year and the 2 rainbow serpents. It holds a number of sacred sites like the Three Brothers,
we're going to do probably a bigger documentary on the Brewarrina mission as part of the ARC research grant. So I'll get to go out to interview more people and to capture those stories, because a lot of the elders are the people who have the memories and stories of their experiences passing away pretty much every year. So that's why oral history, you know, as a discipline is so important to capture those stories while we can. And I'm also open to work with my family in South Australia to tell my grandfather's story. So if you hear the stories about grandfather Fred Johnson, he comes from Nippabunna and Flinders Ranges. So my grandfather, my grandmother's dad comes from Nippabunna. So he left for cultural reasons, and my grandmother. And so grandfather Fred used to make a journey over every year in his with his donkey team. So there's a lot of archival photographs of that. He came, one year he came was the year they were removed. He turned up in Tippabara to find that his kids, his grandkids, his son and his daughter-in-law and the extended family were no longer there. They told him where they were sent to, so him and Granny then took the long trek in the donkey team and went to Brewarrina Mission, and he also stayed there for the 2 years, and he was the one. He also was involved with activism, so he used to get the members of the mission. They couldn't have formal meetings on the mission, so they'd have mission meetings outside, on the outside of the grounds. And he also took his donkey team and travelled around to places like Anglesey, documenting people's and raising people's awareness of what these groups of people were doing, the Aboriginal activists of the 1920s and 30s, and highlighting the plight of Aboriginal people on these places, on the outskirts of these, what was then booming towns. And so unfortunately, I can't apply to Metro Street anymore, so it'll probably have to apply to South Australian if I can, through the family, through their arts grants or whatnot, to tell the story, to collaborate with the family over there, because they tell the story about his trek. So it's remembered by the community what he used to do each year. He'd come across the sand dunes. So it's kind of like an epic story in itself.
It's a feature film.
Yeah, we sort of got ideas. We might start to try to get ABC to take it on. Hey, lads. So explore out. Once I write it up, it's not written yet. The script's not written.
Well, it's quite late. Thank you everybody for coming, and will you please join me once again in thanking our 3 speakers for tonight.